So I introduced him in the morning, and I won't take from him time that he will use in a much more valuable way than I will by introducing him again. So without further ado, Reverend Rivers, the floor is yours. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah. Attached to this stuff. Yeah. That's right. Thank you.
First, I would like to thank again the Loeb Institute for Religious Freedom and the Institute for Religion and Democracy, Sam Golden and Mark, for convening these proceedings to, among other things, honor the legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King during this 50th year commemoration of his life. This is, as a side note, of particular importance to me because as I have studied, reflected on, and sort of observed political developments over the last 40 years or so, it is clear, especially in the case of Black communities in the United States, in our inner cities, that there must be a reappropriation and a reconceptualization of the thought, the life, the legacy of King that re-engages a generation that were in many cases born 30 years after the man passed. So the challenge to the intellectuals is now to engage in creative ways. Put another way, this old Black preacher line that my bishop, because Professor Daniels, in addition to being my mentor as a professor, is also a bishop. So in my tradition, the Church of God in Christ, I deflect, but that's my bishop, right? In the Church of God in Christ. Now he's very humble, right? So he never say that, right? But I'm not that humble, right? That's my friend, so I'm gonna talk about it, right? And so I was thinking about what Professor Dorian has been sharing, and his books are absolutely amazing because their history, their intellectual history, and their historiography. And he goes in deep and hard. And the final word for most of the cognoscenti was that Garrow and Branch had pretty much covered the waterfront. Well, Dorian, from where you from in Michigan, man? Where you from?
Bay County.
Bay County?
Yeah.
So Dorian from Bay County has come, and he has put a new angle and perspective on this thing. So as we would say in the Black community in the 90s, he sort of brings some new jack swing to this thing, right? And so I'm very thankful and appreciate the depth of the power of the achievement, because from where I live, work, and stand, the question is a question of life and death for generations of young Black people who, in too many cases, look up to see the bottom, drown to death in their own blood. And given the current political context, get this, they would be obsolete for slavery, given the restructuring of the labor process. You know, that's a hell of a thing. When you can't even be used for slavery because the predatory logic of Cornell calls it gangster capitalism is reducing the capacity of human beings to be viable in any significant way. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored to be here and very thankful for this presentation, but I come with this burden because there are millions of people locked in these prisons called the inner cities. And in Cornell West, and this has been his deepest and most profound political insight, based on my field work with my wife, who have been working in inner cities with gangs, nihilism. Nihilism. The loss of life, any sense of meaning and purpose. And it's a nihilism which was embedded in structural arrangements and transformations in terms of the economy. But then it took on a life as it spun out from where it emanated and reproduces inequality and the death of hope. I got my text here, right? But I wanted to share this because this discussion, Professor Dorian, all the work that you've done laboring in the vineyard, is now, ladies and gentlemen, a life and death issue. Because the millions of lives can be affected either way by what the intelligentsia does and how we reappropriate the lessons of Martin Luther King to resurrect faith and hope for a generation of young black people who, as I said, are dying in their own blood. Harvard professors Brandon M. Terry and Tommy Shelby, in their recently published volume, To Shape a New World, Essays on the Political Philosophy of Martin Luther King, argue that any attempt to critically engage King's political thought confronts a paradox. On the one hand, there is the inescapable fact that King may be the most globally celebrated political figure, as well as part of the most renowned social movement to have emerged in the United States in the 20th century. Yet, they write, King's having been memorialized so widely and quoted so frequently, serious study and criticism of his writings, speeches, and sermons remain remarkably marginal and underdeveloped within political theology, philosophy, political theory, and the history of political thought, even in the subfields where one would have thought his writings would have been essential reading. In consulting over a dozen volumes on political theology for our proceedings, today I find not a single reference to King. Terry and Shelby observed that the latest edition of Michael Cummings' influential collection, American Political Thought, published in 2015, includes only the letter from a Birmingham jail, giving King roughly the same amount of space as Orestes Brownson and Pat Buchanan. The Oxford Handbook of Political Philosophy, the 2006 edition, has no mention of him whatsoever. In short, philosophers, historians of political thought, and political theorists, whom collectively they designate as political philosophers, neglect King's well-considered and wide-ranging treatments of many important philosophical and political issues, including labor and welfare rights, economic inequality, poverty, love, just war theory, virtue ethics, political theology, violence, imperialism, nationalism, reparations, and social justice. Not to mention his more familiar writings on citizenship, racial equality, voting rights, civil disobedience, and nonviolence. Mr. Goldman, Mr. Tooley, God bless you and thank you. Because it's my prayer that this can be the beginning of a series of adult conversations. Because given where we're at, the fate of the country will depend on those voices of conscience that stand up and provide a voice of reason to resurrect faith and hope for the citizen, not even the folk in the inner cities. They argue that these dual phenomena of ritual celebration and intellectual marginalization are connected, and their entanglement presents both an immediate obstacle and a significant risk to any scholarly venture that claims to examine King's political and philosophical arguments with rigor, clarity, and intellectual integrity. To properly engage King's political theology, one must have a background and context. Cornel West and Gary Goring agreed that Martin King was the most significant and successful organic in American history. The reference to the idea of organic intellectual comes out of the work of Marxist Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci had the view, it was the theory, that the idea of intellectuals and non-intellectuals, translation, smart people and stupid people, right, was actually ill-conceived in that Gramsci argued that across strata in any given society, there are intellectual types in every one of the strata. Now, the fancy people with fancy degrees assumed incorrectly, as Noam Chomsky pointed out 50 years ago, they had a monopoly on ideas, creativity, and thought. Gramsci was much more sophisticated, probably in this case because he was an Italian, right? And concluded that when you look across classes and cultures, every strata, every culture has that person who's an idea person, who actually has a love and interest for ideas. I think from the Black experience. I know my wife and I live in Boston. We hang around with the fancy people up at Harvard Square, and we know the people that y'all read about. And they are all legends in their own mind. And some of them are smart, more of them are not, than is generally acknowledged for obvious reasons. Now keep the book sales going. Somebody say amen. But what is significant, and I know this because I'm 100 years old school Black, and I'm an anthropologist of the human experience. Just because I'm a Black dude, you got to keep my eyes open. And my experience has been, it's very interesting, that Gramsci had it right. If you're Black, you know, I haven't been there in a while, you go to a barbershop every few weeks, and on a Saturday afternoon, you can hear some of the most brilliant and sagacious insights known to humans. With those old school Black dudes who have forgotten more than most of us here will ever know. And I'd always, since I was a child, and I was always sort of amazed at the old school Black, up South Alabama kind of insights, because they could cut right through, you know, all the fog and stupidity and reduce a lot of turgid rhetoric and polysyllabic language, which was not essential to understanding, down to a basic, sagacious insight. And so Gramsci says, listen, in every world you got somebody like that. It's the blue-collar worker that's an Italian from Queens, who's a hard-hat guy, who you see on his lunch break in downtown Manhattan, as they put up those high-rise situations. And they're just amazingly insightful, thoughtful people. So you have an intelligentsia across border. I think of a meeting I was at with a group of police officers, what was it, yesterday? It was yesterday, right? And so one of the officers leaving the meeting, I'm sitting there, and he comes, an Irish guy, big giant Irish guy, kind of blue collar dude, right? And so I asked him about Kavanaugh. So, I'm not, I don't have to stage anything. I'm not some nut from some cafes in Cambridge. So I say, Officer O'Malley, for all intents and purposes. What do you think about the Kavanaugh thing? Without a moment, of course he's lying. Yeah. No, and he probably voted for Trump. But he was not stupid. And as a cop, you spend your time studying liars, right? That's your job, right? And so he said, he said, listen, you have to understand, look, everybody knows he's lying. What idiot? Of course he was. That whole charade, getting up there crying. And then the thing that was interesting to me that I actually applauded, and I shared this with my wife, what he said, what was so disgusting about the guy was not that he lied. Of course he lied. Most of those people have lied. But then he did it in such an undignified way. I love this. Right? You'll forgive me. My masculine side slipped out. I'm pulling back in, right? He says it was so undignified. He cried like somebody who shouldn't cry, right? You can feel the language here, right? He cried and it was so undignified and ridiculous. On top of the line, Gramsci's point was that there are these insightful people who are intellectuals whose insight, context, and framework is embedded in their social station. So you got cops that are intellectuals. You got the old black dude who's the barber, who when you walk in on a Saturday afternoon can provide you all kinds of insight and has an amazing view, being from Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, of white people. And he does it with such gentleness and a courtly manner, right? He's not angry at anybody, right? He sort of understands what the deal is, and he's always courteous and polite. And it was that culture out of which King came. The idea of being crude and vulgar and cussing the crap out, and that one, it was tasteless, no class, and that wasn't the proper way to conduct yourself because you're a Christian. And I was a Christian, and I wasn't taught to talk like that. I know what the man is, but I ain't got to cuss at him to make it worse. This intelligentsia. So Martin Luther King is, and this is one of Cornell's brilliant formulations, right? Is this organic intellectual in the Gramscian sense, right? Who has this insight, this perspective, this wisdom about to know when to protest, when to engage, and when to withdraw. And so we want to engage in the current political crisis. Our country desperately needs to rediscover the moral and prophetic example of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. His writings on the topic of nonviolence provide a path for us to begin to accomplish this. His commitment to loving nonviolent struggle and protest were a principal response to the verifiable injustices committed against defenseless black people in this society. Yet 50 years after his prophetic life, the philosophic and political theological import of this singular figure of the 20th century has not been sufficiently examined, despite the excellent scholarship that has been published this year. From King's conception of love and nonviolence sprang the equally weighty responsibility of confronting those responsible with the call to end a system of racial terror. In his essay, Nonviolence and Racial Justice, published in the Christian Century in 1957, Dr. King laid out a path forward for the country on the basis of a love-based nonviolent resistance. He wrote, "At the center of nonviolence stands the principle of love, the biblical idea of agape love. In struggling for human dignity, the oppressed people of the world must must not allow themselves to become bitter or to indulge in hate campaigns. Now, King's insight was more than moral. I mean, it's good not to hate people. I mean, just as a general rule, right? So it's not good for your blood pressure, right? And it's not a lot that you get done, and the hatred takes you into revenge and retribution, and that becomes a case of diminishing returns. See, the other part of this, in terms of his political theology, was that the Catholics have this idea. How many Catholics got you with? How many Catholics? One. All right, so there's two of us. Right. I'm sure you got Christ playing with that. Right? So it's the idea of prudentia, prudent judgment, wisdom, discretion, insight. King understood that being consumed by hatred didn't work for you. Yeah, you're black, you got high blood pressure anyway, right? So you don't need to accelerate the situation, right? By getting yourself all worked up. King understood that. And so he shared with his oppressed community. You know, one, the ethic of agape love. Two, look, boy, it don't make no sense. You all get worked up. What you gonna do? You're not gonna be able to fight that, man. You ain't got enough pistols. So we've got to come another way. So there's a better way. The way of love. Agape love. And that was a profound political insight. I don't want to pause here, right? And you see, King's genius is now so desperately needed because I'm of the age of those young people who thought they were going to be black revolutionaries, make black revolution. And so we said, yes, son, I never said it because I was Pentecostal and I respected the preachers. But all the other ones that hadn't been civilized in church would talk trash and talk about the Lord and all of that, not understanding that they did not understand. No, you don't want to pick up a gun against this boy because it's not going to work for you. It's a trick. And you're going to get sucked into a game you will never win. And then after they brutalize you and terrorize you, they're going to flip the script and say that you attacked them. And so a whole generation of young black people who did not understand the wisdom of the fathers and the mothers of the faith about discretion and prudence were overwhelmed. And it became a tragedy which descended into this nihilistic kind of, I don't want to say identity politics, it was worse than that. That was just destructive for a generation. To retaliate with hate and bitterness would do nothing but intensify the hate in the world. Along the way of life, someone must have sense enough, come on somebody, and morality enough to cut off the chain of hate. And this is a brilliant insight. This is a deep insight. You understand? I'm there the night when King gets assassinated as they tried to burn West Philadelphia down. I mean, they went and they tried to burn the place down. But it was those insights of King which we lost, which we now recover. We now must recover. This can only be done only by projecting the ethics of love to the center of our lives. If Dr. King were here today, we know from the historical record that he would have condemned in the most explicit terms any form of violent political protest. He would have condemned both the program and the violence of the neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and other hate groups. They have the constitutional right to speak and protest the removal of Confederate statues to air their grievance, but they must embrace Dr. King's example of nonviolence. King would have spoken up clearly on all of that. In fact, his entire program was designed to show the moral and political bankruptcy of those who traded in racism. King would not have sanctioned the violent actions of extremists such as Antifa either. These are just as deplorable and equally intolerable. If they seek to resist racism, they too must adopt Dr. King as the exemplar of righteous resistance. For Dr. King, nonviolence did not mean staying silent. It meant speaking and acting against racism while avoiding the violent tactics of the racists. Now it's then. We must choose whether this country will overcome deep racial and political divisions with truth, justice, and forgiveness, or deepen them with hatred and violence. Concrete examples of forgiveness continue to show the importance of heeding the better angels of our nation. In Charleston, South Carolina, in 2015, the congregation of Mother Emanuel AME Church reacted with love and forgiveness to an act of domestic terrorism. The pastor and 8 members of the congregation were murdered immediately following a prayer meeting, which the killer had attended with them. Their reaction stood in sharp contrast to the urge to retaliate that has met violence elsewhere. Terrorist Dylan Roof had wanted to launch a race war, but the forgiveness expressed by the families of the victims and the congregation affected meant that love ended the outbreak of racist violence. The church community reminded us of the truth of Reverend King's words 50 years ago in his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, where he wrote, returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only the light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. The forgiveness shown by the community of Mother Emanuel captured the attention of the world because hatred and revenge are often easier paths to follow than love, nonviolence, and forgiveness. When wronged, an eye for an eye is often more appealing to us mortals than the tougher admonition to love your enemies. For that reason, among others, love and nonviolence are now all the more powerful, especially in a democracy. These principles do not enable evil or violence to triumph. Rather, they break their hold and show a better path forward by staking out a moral high ground that is indisputable. Acting on these standards underlines the deficiencies of the opposite path and shows a better way to our antagonists. The better path, the only path to our salvation as a country, was made clear by Reverend King in 1967. The beauty of nonviolence is that in its own way and in its own time, it seeks to break the chain reaction of evil. We can again break the chain reaction, and the prescription is the same one given by Dr. King. Just as King's writings understandably reflect his most profound insights, they also reveal the limitations of a vision by its omission. Nowhere in the books he authored or in his recorded speeches did King adequately explore the immense power of the supernatural in the struggle over justice in this country. And this is where my Pentecostal thing comes in, right? This is where I ain't gonna back away from it, right? This, because this is very important. You see, one of the important ideas that the people of faith must recapture is a sense of the power of God. You have in the Greek, exousia, as in authority. Then, doctor, we've got the concept of dunamos in the Greek. Now, the Holy Ghost folk, we like that, but that's dynamite, like dynamite. Believing in the power of God. And this is very, very important because I'm going to take the discussion. I'm not going to understand. My wife sort of gave me the thing, watch your clock, right? So my wife just gave me like a car thing. She takes me around the country to keep me civilized, right? One of the things, and this is connected to Professor Doran's ideas about the social gospel, is that the faith community and the black churches in a period of such acute crisis must have a prayer life that understands the politics of intercessory prayer. Amen. high cotton, fancy intellectuals, right? Y'all may look down on that, but that's okay. Because I got the dynamite, right? Push it on the shelf and blow the whole thing up, right? But this is very important as a spiritual discipline. I'm going to keep moving and wrap this thing up. Martin Luther King's understanding was conceptually and to some extent in terms of pneumatology, epistemologically less than adequate. Because the next epoch of the struggle, and this is very important, I'm going to bring this thing home. We are now in a crisis that is unparalleled in terms of the political and economic context. King is struggling in the 50s and 60s in the United States within a growth economy. Part of Lyndon Johnson's mistake is that he thought he could pay for everything. So he was going to undertake a criminal war, right? And thought that he was going to wage a war on power. That was irrational. And one of the brilliant things about King, and I'll just do this quick, is that in 64-65, Senator Fulbright hosted a meeting on the Vietnam War. And he brought in George F. Kennan, who was the uber patrician, aristocratic author of the containment policy. And Kennan, before the world, said the Vietnam War is a ridiculous idea. That's the executive summary, right? Because America jumps around like an elephant running from a mouse. And there's no logical reason for this. Now watch me now. Now, Kennan had a brilliant insight, right? He was the uber white man. He was a patrician, tall, lean, you got that square jaw kind of white guy, right? So he was authoritative. White man, square jaw, Princeton, author of Mr. X of the containment policy and foreign affairs. He's authoritative. When he said it was law. And Johnson wasn't happy, but he gave the man respect. 2 years later, black dude, Atlanta, Georgia, Baptist preacher, Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, said the same thing that Kennan said. It was like the old black Sam jacket. Difference where an old white man in Atlanta, Georgia, old white man going down the street, I'm selling water. Ice. And old black man. And so there were a bunch of people outside of the street, Professor, and they said it was hot, man. It was like, oh, it's hot in Atlanta, Georgia, right? Nobody bought the ice from the old black man. Right? So 2 hours later, old white dude come by. Selling water. Selling ice. Thank you. Selling ice. And Negro said, oh, come on, let's all go get some ice, y'all. So all the black people ran across the street to get some ice. So the old black guy who come back forward said, how come you didn't buy my ice? And the Negro said, because your ice wasn't cold enough. Now some of y'all didn't even catch this. Ice. There's a temperature for ice. Come on, get the joke. Lord, bless these people. We can keep it moving and we'll wrap it up. One of the most fascinating but least explored dimensions of King's thought and practice is his understanding of the realm of the pneuma and its relationship to the temporal reality of political society. See, this is deep here now, because most people have not talked about a political theology of the pneumos and what difference it makes of how one employs and deploys the New Testament concept of power, right? Authoritative or exousia or pneumos. As I wrap this thing up, there's something enormously rich, and there is a unique historical opportunity in this period because of the depth of the crisis, where a new political theology that moves, that's a political theology of agape, as my Marshall was saying, right, that explores, that must animate any initiative to repair the breach in this society. King is revolutionary political theology of pneumos and agape that speaks to the existential crisis of the suffering of the poor and addresses the depth of the nihilism that now overwhelms this society from the White House to the hood. Thank you very much. Now, I would definitely over Jackie. See, Jackie just, I'm just, you know, my wife trying to keep me civilized, y'all.
I'll take the privilege of the first question. Why don't you, can you tell us about how William Stringfellow's conception?
Okay, I'll do this. I'll do this quickly. I told y'all I was raised in the Black Pentecostal church. And this is a short version of why this is important existentially for me. I'm raised in an enormously tough neighborhood. I mean, Philadelphia was run by gangs. Started with the police commission. It was just gangs. Frank Rizzo, dude, I mean, in fact, listen, people don't even know police brutality. You know these old Black Lives Matter kids running around here? So let me tell you something. Frank Rizzo knew how to beat you. And he knew how to kill you. I mean, really kill you, right? Now, long short, it was a Black Pentecostal church that pulled me off the street. And I saw, now some of y'all too sophisticated, I saw the miraculous. I saw a Black church which started with 7 people, with a 2-fisted, devout Black preacher named Benjamin Smith, who built it from like 7 people to about 15,000. Now, mind you, Professor, he was not a mega church celebrity guy. He was a working class Black dude who wore the same suit every week. A black suit, now I'm going to test you here now, Professor, with some high top Stacey Adams with a spit shot. And he preached, and I experienced the power of Pentecost as a transformative force that could transform the lives of people that had been left for dead. And I saw this with my own eyes. Because after my conversion, I would travel almost halfway across the city of Philadelphia. You out there, you lived in a good part, right? And it was gang violence. And as a result of the transformation that we as young men had, I'm going to speak this in code. There was an ethic that it generated. I don't be so cool here with it, right? That said you respected everybody and you didn't exploit nobody. Now, I done said something, some of y'all will catch it, right? You don't take advantage of nobody. I'm trying to tell y'all something here, right? And you were appropriate with everybody. Now, is that clear enough for y'all? Right? In other words, there was a revolutionary experience, and I didn't want to get unnecessarily provocative, right? And go the pneumatology route. But my point is this. Professor Dorian, as I'm Black and I stand here, the next wave of the revival of the best of Martin Luther King is going to come out the most ignorant Black church that everybody written off. Pentecostals. And this is an amazing phenomenon, right? That most white folk don't catch because y'all don't run down the basement. But watch this. Robert Franklin, one of your fans, said the 19th century was the century of the A&E. And he said the 20th century, as confirmed by will be the century of the Baptists. And he said the 21st century will be the century of the Pentecostals. The people that nobody saw coming. It starts with William J. Seymour, after whom the Seymour Institute for Black Church and Policy Studies is named. With a handful of people, there are now 600 million Pentecostals across the world. And they're growing as a force. And I simply said, I'm going to go heavy on this, right? We are going to take the work that Professor Dorian and others have done, and we're moving it. One of my mentor, Professor Daniels, is literally, as we speak, doing international work in Africa with some of these church movements that nobody's ever heard of. And so, didn't want to go heavy on that piece, but let me just say this to you. Don't sleep. The black church is coming back because God always, see, there's an old line. It might look like Friday, Friday the crucifixion, right? Might look, but Sunday's coming. So those of y'all that don't believe, that's okay. I got enough faith for you too. Sunday's coming. Now I ain't worried about it. You ain't got to you don't believe God. Not a problem. Not a problem. Yes, sir. In the back.
Thank you so much. As a charismatic, I agree with you on it.
Come on, Doc. You know what's happening. I can tell you charismatic by a shirt and tie. I know you got the Holy Ghost, boy. You're just like a brother.
A couple months ago, Robert P. George and Cornel West hosted a conversation on Dr. King, which they did an amazing job.
Yeah.
One of the main points they brought up is so many of the values that Dr. King brought to the political discussion and his movement, or the image of God in people, forgiveness, nonviolence, and loving your neighbor, loving your enemy. All these values that come from the Judeo-Christian framework.
Yeah.
As today, there's a lot of distancing from Judeo-Christian foundations or sources. How do we bring back those values or re-energize those values? Do we have to do it as a part of bringing back and re-familiarizing ourselves with the Judeo-Christian foundations and sources? Because obviously, from Dr. King and even your experiences, it's not just obviously those ideas are there as well, but also there's the personal experience of God doing something in people, and then that leads to a lot of these values being demonstrated publicly.
Excellent question. Let me tell you something interesting. See, God's got a great sense of humor. He'll start at the bottom. Spirit of the Lord's on me because He anointed me to preach good news to the poor, the healing and sick, to recover the sight of the blind. See, Luke 4:18. And God, being a communist, in this sense, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, that community, right, always has a love for the poor. See, you know what happens, God? God will move among the poor. Nobody will look for them because everybody presumes they're inferior without ability. They have the conversion experience that transforms their life, and then 100 years later, there's 600 million of them. Listen, you just stay tuned, son. See, right now, there is this epic crisis, and all across the world, there are people whose lives are being transformed, and they're going to transform. Listen, the blood of the martyrs cries up to the throne of God. It is not forgotten what his manservant did as he paid the price to the end. And you see, it's deep. And Professor Doran, you were there. One of the things, and I'll make this quick. The last place that Martin Luther King preached was the mother church of Pentecost in the United States, the Church of God in Christ. And for me, it's a kairos moment in context. In that, in my reading, King had done the best he could. He had given every single thing that he had. And God's servant was exhausted. He preaches his eulogy. He eulogizes himself before he went home to be with the Lord. But the spirit that was part of that prophetic movement was deposited in that place. It would take 50 years for someone to sort of begin to think as the Holy Spirit, this is my Pentecostal meeting, right? This thing would gestate, right? Who would have thunk? And part of the, David Jannings knows this, part of what happened in Memphis was something that my wife and I, and actually Professor Daniel, had started 10 years ago when we did a big event. And my point is that, son, it's coming. See, at the point at which everybody thinks the game's over, that's when God moves. That's biblical history. That's the slave experience for me. At the point at which we were ready to throw in the towel, God would bless and raise somebody up. We was catching hell down there, boy. And God raised up a kid named Michael who became Martin. And it will happen again. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much.
That's
I
your
told
Bible,
you-
child? Oh, okay.
Oh,
Why don't you pull your Bible?
no, no, just my little notebook. I told you that I'm an Anglican, but I'm also a charismatic too.
All right.
So,
Watch it now. You got problems coming.
And I believe in intercessory prayer. I also believe in spiritual warfare. And I've done a lot of study on the East Africa revival and how that transformed people in so many countries and has impacted the entire world. But, after that, Idi Amin came and there was that horrible persecution. And we know that there are demonic forces that even if people are raised up, there are spiritual forces that are against that. And just what would you say about that kind of doing that kind of spiritual warfare to protect and to wage against what
Okay,
would
now I'm
happen?
going to try to say this in the most sophisticated white intellectual way I can. Right? I don't want to antagonize nobody over here, right? Because I'm wrong, do task. Right? Let me put it this way. Well, first of all, Professor Dorn, I'm going to get you in front of hundreds of these people with the work that you've done. I'm on a God thing now. I'm in the spirit realm now. All that amazing work you've done is not for nothing. Because Bishop Daniels is here, we'll verify. We're going to, you see, there's got to be intercessory prayer. But that's an alien concept for some folk in this room. That's got to happen. It's happening. The movement for justice will require that level of intensity because the level of evil that's at 1600 Pennsylvania is something else. And it's going to take a level of prayer, right? And prophetic confidence. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar, and here again, the Babylonian metaphor ain't inappropriate, right? We need some Hebrew boys and girls that are not going to bend and bow before Nebuchadnezzar. It's that kind of thing. Because we're in that kind of space. And so, the short answer to your question is, I'm going to take one more because I have to sit down. Because I'm not trying to turn this into no revival meeting and get you high, sit high, look low. Yeah, elites saying Rivers trying to come up here and start some mess, right? Get a prayer meeting going. Right? I see Thule in the back getting nervous, right? Let's wrap this up right now. There you go. I got you, Doc. I'm ready to go. Last question I got to say. In fact, I'm going to sit down now. You can ask the question.
You talk about the 20th century being the century of the Baptist, and perhaps exemplified maybe by Billy Graham and by his.
I would start with it. I mean, I take your point, but that's not the dude I start with.
And yet there is maybe perhaps a certain neutrality that he had on civil rights, and perhaps others in those circles during that.
I'm going to let the historian answer. I'm not touching Billy Graham. I'm the wrong demographic.
I guess regarding that ideology, tell me, what would you affirm and what would you reject about how they approached these sort of issues of racial justice?
I'm not being facetious.
Yeah.
Professor Doran, this is the last question. Dr. Tula, you hear me? That's the last question. And we're going to bring this thing in.
Really? Well, firstly, there is a story here yet to be told. Billy Graham was a player. Not quite the story that he told, because I think he did whitewash how he played it. He was very political about how he did so. But he did have King on the platform at Madison Square Garden in 1957, and King understood what that meant, that for him to be up there, and King could imagine the role that he could play arm in arm with Graham, if Graham was willing to go through the South and go West and just swing all through this this country, doing revivals together. That is what King wanted. And it is true, Billy Graham was one of the few people who could call him Mike during that period, and it was close enough to him that, it wasn't just a fantasy that it could happen. However, that's the only time that Martin Luther King was ever on the platform with Graham, and in years to come, as in years just before that, Graham sometimes is willing to preach to segregate audiences, and sometimes not, just depending on where he was and how close we are to Asheville. And what the politics were locally.
So, this is nowhere near what it could have been. Had Graham been willing to had he cared enough, had he been willing to risk what was clearly being called for by King and even by Reinhold Niebuhr. Now, I give way more credit to King's version of this than Niebuhr's, right? Because Niebuhr himself is not willing to risk with his audiences sort of offending the moral sensibility of white liberals to make them deal with their own white supremacy. He never does with that. He never even talks about it in those terms. In fact, the only time he even violates his own rules about how this rather mannered discourse should go was when he calls out Billy Graham, that he should do this. He should risk some of his popularity in crowds where Graham would be in danger, something Niebuhr isn't risking either. So, it's King's version of this I am far more sympathetic to. But there is, nonetheless, for all of that, Graham did enormously important work. And he is the one for whom there are a whole lot of white evangelicals for whom they never even considered taking a decent, just minimally decent position on this whole constellation of issues, except for Billy Graham. And Billy Graham got them there.
There you go. That's a trustworthy answer. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Our souls have been refreshed by Reverend Rivers. We can now refresh our bodies. Coffee is being served in the hallway outside this room, and we will reconvene here. I want to give as much time